Well, as we've been reporting, the Protect Ontario by Unleashing Our Economy Act, or Bill 5, has now been passed, despite the concerns being raised by First Nations. It's the latest piece of legislation provincial governments have been looking to approve, as jurisdictions all over are looking to get development projects off the ground in the face of the Trump tariffs. For more, our Truth and Politics panel is here. Jennifer Laewetz is the CEO of Paskwâw Strategies, and Niigaan Sinclair is a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Thanks to you both for being here. Jennifer, we'll start with you. Bill 5 has passed in the Ontario legislature. Your thoughts on the bill passing and, some of the debate around this that saw MPP Saul Mamakwa removed from the legislature earlier in the week?
Well, I think we're essentially seeing what kickstarted I Don't Know More in the beginning essentially happening again. Legislation that's being passed that looks to override treaty rights and the duty to consult, and not just the duty to consult, but the duty to attempt to receive consent as well. And, I saw that Saul was kicked out of the chamber for essentially saying what needed to be said about, Doug Ford kind of trampling over treaty rights and being disingenuous with First Nations, which is exactly what's happening. When government continues to talk about reconciliation and continue to talk about how they want these great relationships and they respect treaty rights and all of these things, but then they're actively passing legislation that bulldozes directly over all of those components, then I think we have a pretty telling sign that, the Ontario government and Doug Ford does not take reconciliation seriously, nor does he respect treaty rights.
There was a funny clip I thought there yesterday when Ford was talking about Trump trying to bulldoze, and he wasn't going to be allowing that to happen. Niigaan, Saul Mamakwa was live on social media earlier this morning saying that the sleeping giant has been awoken. What do you think happens next?
Well, this situation's a little bit more complicated, I think, than what the I Don't Know More conditions were back in 2012, 2011, because we were facing Stephen Harper in those days. I was an activist. There were many of us that met very quickly. There was a big movement led by young students, mostly women, but that sort of singular force that was being faced off against Stephen Harper had a decade of mistreatment of Indigenous peoples, and then the omnibus legislations which sparked this national outcry. It's not quite the same thing, only because what we're seeing is kind of a whole-scale move by premiers to begin to do exactly what Jen's talking about, trample on those rights, move quickly, declare projects of national significance or provincial significance. We're also seeing, though, NDP provincial governments in BC, for example, moving very quickly to move beyond the time it takes to adequately consult and fulfill constitutional duties. So it will be something that is interesting to see, because in BC, if you look at the relationship between the BC Union of Chiefs and, of course, the NDP government, which has long been allies with one another, now it's turned into a rancorous, toxic kind of threats called between each one of them. The question will be whether First Nations people, who have all the different political tastes and political interests, will unify on this singular issue of resource development. That will be curious to see whether that happens, because we know that there's many First Nations people, for example, in Mark Carney's government, not just in ministers, but also within staff, within Indigenous affairs, and so on.
Jennifer, Bill 5, the Protect Ontario by Unleashing Our Economy Act, as Niigaan mentions, is not the only piece of legislation of this kind being passed by provincial governments. And First Nations in each province are saying there was no consultation. When it comes to the Ring of Fire alone, I think I've been reporting on that for like 18 years. Was there a need to rush these bills?
I think, the provinces are in a state where there is an active tug of war happening right now with the conversation around sovereignty at a provincial level, at a national level, and even with our First Nations governance. And I think what's happening now is that we're seeing provinces say, well, Ottawa has been stagnant. We haven't been seeing resource development like we should be. We're actually seeing legislation and, policy out of the federal government, like the emissions cap and things like that, that provinces and industry feel like are trampling on their non-existent right to essentially just get projects up and rolling at an unprecedented rate. And, I know that provinces do want to see growth in their provinces. I'm not naive to that. Industry in Saskatchewan is huge. Agriculture, potash, those are the things that keep our economy going. But at the same time, there are First Nations across the country that want to be consulted with and consent. And one of the things that I wish people knew more of is that, you know, self-determination is huge. And it's not that every nation or every First Nations person is against resource development, but it's not just about consult and consent. It's also making sure that if those decisions are made or projects go through and they are, you know, being rammed through our traditional territories, that we are active participants at the table. You know, resource revenue sharing, having those conversations, helping outline what environmental protection actually means, how those projects should move forward. But not only are these provincial governments looking to just bulldoze over our rights, get projects moving, but we're actually being left out. And our communities will continue to live in poverty because of it. And who knows the land better than our people? So any project that moves forward throughout our traditional territories, we should be at the table. And it's going to differ province by province and treaty by treaty, whether it's Dene, Cree, Dakota people, but we still need to have our protocols outlined and be at those tables.
Yeah, Niigaan, there has been a lot of talk this week about who exactly should be at those tables. And earlier today, the Ford government announced that it was inviting Canada's premiers and the national Indigenous leaders to gather in late July in Muskoka to move national building projects forward. What do you expect to come out of that meeting?
Well, I was encouraged to see and hear National Chief Cindy Woodhouse identify clearly that she's not a rights holder. And so really she should not be part of these meetings. This is for rights holders within individual First Nations that are the holders of those abilities to provide consent. You know, Canada's always wanted to deal with one kind of Native person, one Native organization, one chief, and has always imposed that, whether it's in the Indian Act, whether it's in negotiations, even with the constitutional talks back in the 1980s. They've never wanted to deal with a group of people. They want to deal with one person. And that's the fundamental problem, is that we are not a monolith. We're not a one singular voice. We are 640 plus recognized First Nations, another 150 who are in the process of recognition, hundreds of Métis communities, Red River Métis Nation, which is quite identifiable, that other nations that are talking about themselves as mixed blood people in different ways. And then, of course, the Inuit communities. If anything, perhaps maybe you could talk to Inuit organizations, but even that, I think, would turn into a fractious sort of conversation. The bottom line of it is that Canada's got to find ways to be able to deal with Indigenous peoples appropriately, culturally specifically, and geographically. Because if you leave First Nations people, for example, to say, if you say to them, how do you want to deal with us, they will form. And many of them will be, for instance, the James Bay Cree. They will form their own organization and say, this is how we are going to deal with you. And they do it collectively. So the problem is, of course, this one-stop approach of forcing First Nations, Métis, Inuit governments, communities into one model.
Niigaan, Jennifer, we'll have to leave it there for this week. Appreciate you both being here.
Yeah, you got you.